Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale early pattern Armortek German Tiger 1. Since the last video update, a lot of progress has been made to the tank's lower hull, as well as the installation of the tank's running gear. We'll be going over these additions and features in this video. Just prior to adding on the base coat of Dunkel Gelb to the lower hull, it's time to add on the rear idler mounts. Here go the rear idler mounts here, broken down from the kit parts. The parts that you see here are almost identical to the current designs which Armortek are using on their current batch of Tigers. The way the parts break down are as follows. Over here we have the actual idler mount itself. It's comprised out of a single piece of CNC steel. The pieces are very robust and very rugged, and are also very, very strong. On this portion here, this is where the actual idler wheel mounts to and rotates, while this portion here gets inserted into the hull, and this is where the piece is actually adjusted. These two pieces here are made out of CNC'd brass. And these pieces here are actually the little cup that mounts to the rear hull of the tank, and the adjustment screw locks in as follows. These two components here, which are made out of CNC aluminum, these are the actual yoke in which the component will pivot on. For the pivots, those are facilitated by these two brass lugs over here. They are pre-threaded, and the long fastener is the actual piece that does all of the tensioning and loosening of the rear idler. For a quick compare and contrast, here we have the first generation, and on top of here we have, still in their bags, the parts from the 2015 release. As you can see, very little has changed from the original Armortek parts, and the components still function exactly the same. And here are the same parts now, but now with their coat of primer added. Just like with all the other parts, since these are made out of steel, it is a good idea to get it in its coat of primer to protect the component from any sort of oxidation, as well as any sort of rust that can develop on the piece over time. Also, with the coat of primer added, it gives for a nice base for the actual base coat to stick and bond with the part once added as well. And here's a close-up of the assembly, all assembled and fitted to the vehicle. The way you see it here is purely stock configuration. They assemble very easy and effortlessly out of the box. One modification I did make, though, was I went ahead and added a lock washer to the mounting fastener on this location here. This fastener here locks the idler mount to the swing arm assembly. One quick procedure that I did do prior to filming of this scene was that on the swing arm itself, I went ahead and added some grease on the portion of the stem which slides into the bushing. This smeared grease here was done for the same exact reasons that was done to the swing arms in the previous video. While in this configuration here, you can see how it works. Basically, you have this large Allen bolt. This cap screw here locks into this brass lug which is mounted to the hull. The lug itself is simply just glued in place and no other mods are needed for it. The piece here sits inside this container, and when it comes time to adjust the track from the outside of the vehicle with an Allen wrench, you can loosen or tighten the component as you see fit. By loosening or tightening this component, this lug here rides on the threads, which will then either pull in or emerge outward, which will move the idler mount to the correct and desired track tension. Now currently there is no tension on the idler mount, which is why it is freely moving the way you see it here. Once the track is put onto the vehicle, the force of the track will force the idler mount into its cavity and keeping everything firmly in place. Now this system does work. However, one modification that I make to all of these Armortek vehicles is that I add a retaining plate here in order to keep this fastener from ever flopping outward in case track tension is ever lost. Say if a track link gets broken and there's no more tension on the track from the track, and the idler mount can have a tendency to pivot out of the way. Once the vehicle is fully built and painted, getting access to this location here is a bit problematic, so the retention plate is a nice feature to add. And here goes the lower hull just prior to the installation of the base coat of paint. One bit of detailing that I missed in the previous video was that of the sponson mounted rivet fasteners. As we can recall, the Tiger 1 features a very distinctive angled strip which mounts to the side of the tank, which on the real vehicle supports the side hull with the lower sponson. In that video, you'll see that I went ahead and added the rivets to the side portion of the strip. However, I forgot to add on the row of dome-headed rivets, which are found on the top part of the sponson. Here is a closer look of the angled strip with the rivets now added. As you can see, there are actually two types of rivets that are used on this vehicle. For the ones mounted to the side hull, the rivets were a very flush appearance on the real tank, while for the sponson mounted fasteners, they were your traditional dome-headed rivets. For the model here, I went ahead and drilled out and marked all the locations where the rivets would be present, and I inserted real brass rivets for the detailing of this piece. I could have went ahead and used my usual resin headed dome rivets. However, because of the tank being radio controlled and this area which is in peril of getting hit with obstacles as well as any type of dirt and debris, the resin rivets probably would not have held up very well. So in their place, I simply replaced or added the real copper rivet that you see here. In addition to the rivets, I also went ahead and added the missing weld line, which is found on the center portion of the sponson, as the real tank sponson was comprised out of two pieces, which were centrally welded together. This exact layout is a mirror image on the reverse side of the tank. While the putty is drying, I'm going to go ahead and add another bit of detailing to the top. Only this portion of the detailing is actually kit supplied with the model, and that is of the two rear engine access hatches. The real early production Tiger 1s featured these two plates in this location of the vehicle in order to get access to the engine without needing to remove the engine from the engine bay. These parts here are kit supplied and are laser cut out of thin sheet steel and simply bolt onto the tank with the pre-cut fastener location holes on the lower plate as well as on the hatch itself. Now, what's interesting is that this exact same design is left virtually unchanged and is literally identical to the older units, as these two hatches here are from the 2015 version of the Tiger 1. As you can see, they are literally interchangeable with each other. Now, also as of note, this style of lower hull detailing is only found on early production Tigers. If you were building your tank as a later production unit in which you want to have a really detailed, accurate lower hull, this style of engine hatches would be inaccurate, as the design was redesigned for the later production units in which a square hatch access panel was developed. It is at this point on the build now where I can now focus on the tank's road wheels. Now, the road wheels on the Tiger 1, as everyone knows, are interleaved. On the Armortek kit from the first generation batch, the road wheels broke down as follows. You have a single tire road wheel, a double tire road wheel, several spacers, an end cap fastening plate, lots and lots of ball bearings, and finally a end mount to mount everything to the swing arms. Also found on the kit road wheels are that of rubber tires. One thing that separates these early style kits from their more recent releases is that the road wheels that you see here are actually comprised out of casted aluminum alloy. They are not made of CNC. The newer generation components in comparison, from like this one here is from the 2015 release, are comprised out of CNC'd aluminum. Also, the double road wheel that you see here was a way for Armortek to simplify the production, as the real Tiger One utilized for its double road wheels lots of single wheels, which were in turn then bolted together via a complex network of flanges. On my static initial production Tiger One video series, I go into further detailing about those road wheels in that video. Also, due to the road wheel being casted double, it has no interior portion of detailing. It's just a simple cavity that we have here. Now, as of note, this is only found on the interior portion of the wheels, which is not visible to the viewer. Also, to point out a certain feature, the way you see the road wheels here were partially assembled by the customer. That is why they have a coat of a very durable primer added to their surfaces. When you would receive the kits brand new, or if you in its virgin state, the components would be left in their cast metal coloring. Also, the rubber tires were another piece that was pre-fitted by the previous builder, and the adhesive that he used is actually very, very strong and sturdy, and these wheels will not come off during the tank's operation. Like I mentioned before, the wheels would be in a format like this, in which you would have a rubber tire, and the rubber tire simply slips onto the rim, to which then it gets glued on with adhesives. Now, the kit only supplies you with two types of wheels, and both designs are used in order to fill out the tank's road wheels. As for which wheels are designated for inner and outer, this is left to the spacers that we have here. Spacers are CNC'd aluminum. They are a one-piece component and are really effective in performing their job. In addition to the spacers, another way to determine if it's an inner and outer is that of the actual hubcap detailing itself. The hubcaps are different due to the inner and outer due to their depth. Just like on the real Tiger One, they do have their conical appearance to them, which is pre-machined into the piece by Armortek. In contrast, here we have the wheels from the 2015 Tiger One. Like I mentioned before, the pieces are all CNC. There are no castings which are utilized on these components. Their breakdown is similar to the older design, but are much more advanced. The rubber tires are almost identical. You're going to, of course, need a lot of ball bearings. They get mounted to the swing arms in the exact same way with a center-mounted fastener mount. They also have their detailing end caps with the conical shapes. Where the difference lies is with the wheels itself. Like we saw before, for the double wheel, Armortek went ahead and give you one wheel that mounts on two tires. For the 2015 release, this is done more prototypical, more realistic to the real Tiger One, and you have all these single wheels here that in turn get bolted together via their flanges. Here are the flanges here, and the flanges also act as a spacer, replacing the other two components that were mentioned earlier. Before I can go ahead and install the wheels, I need to make a quick modification to the model's hubcap flange. As we recall from the previous scene, the flanges are kit supply, they're CNC'd aluminum, and they're pre-drilled with the mounting fastener holes. Now, on the real Tiger One, the flange actually had more fastener hole locations than what's found on the Armortek kit. In order to make the piece more detailed, I went ahead and with a drill bit, I added a hole on the middle portions in between the places where the holes are found on the kit. This was done with a drill press in order to ensure that the holes are nicely drilled straight through and through. With the holes now drilled, these pieces here would be going into paint. Now normally I would go ahead and add a coat of primer and then the paint. However, since the pieces were pre-painted by the customer, the primer procedure is not going to be necessary, and these pieces are just going to go straight into their base coat. Once in base coat, they'll be ready for installation. And here's the tank hull just prior to the installation of the road wheels. As you can see, since the addition of the base coat, I went ahead and also added the airbrush weathering to the undersides of the model. The reason why I go ahead and add these weathering now as opposed to once the model is fully built is that once the road wheels are on, the model will be, for one, very, very heavy and will never be able to be put on the underhull again due to the sheer weight. Also, with the way these German tanks are designed with the interwoven road wheels, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to thoroughly get to the under areas of the suspension and of the lower hull once everything is fitted. So it's always at this point on my builds in which I go ahead and add the weathering. And here's just a quick close-up of the weathering. As you can see, all of the swing arms still have their protective tapes on them. Just after the filming of the scene, all of the tape will be removed, and the axles will have their road wheels fitted. In addition to the lower hull, the weathering was also applied to all of the road wheels and road wheel components, both outside and in, for the same reasons why I mentioned before. Now, as for painting the road wheels, as we recall from the previous scene, the road wheels were pre-assembled by the customer. He went ahead and glued the tire on with a special type of adhesive. The adhesive that he used was so good that I had a lot of difficulty in removing the rim. So much so that if I would have attempted, the rim would have ripped. So rather than going ahead and trying to remove the rim, I went ahead and painted it with a mask. As for the mask, it is a simple lid from a 1-gallon paint bucket. With a 5-inch hole saw, I went ahead and removed a section of the lid. Now, what I did was I simply put the mask over the road wheel, and with the spray gun, I painted the piece. The mask protected the rubber from being fully exposed to the spray gun, which prevented overspray from getting onto the rubber tires. This mask was utilized on all of the road wheels that we have. And here are the wheel axles with their protective tapes removed and with a small smear of grease added to the surface. Just like I mentioned on all of these builds, I like to go ahead and add a protective film of grease. The grease serves several functions. First, it helps with the actual rotation of the wheel, making it spin nice and smooth. It also helps with the installation of the road wheels. It helps them glide onto their appropriate locations. And third of all, it protects the steel from any type of corrosion or rust that can develop if moisture or any other type of debris enters into the recesses. One important tip though when adding the grease is that if you notice, I go ahead and add the grease to the axle portion of the swing arm. However, the face portion has no grease added. Because of the threads and how the fasteners mount to the axle, you want to have absolutely no grease or any other type of lubricant in this location here, as it can interrupt with the Loctite and can potentially unthread itself while the vehicle's in operation, which is less than ideal. Just like with the Real Tiger 1, on this model here, the road wheels need to be installed in a set of layers. Starting with the innermost wheels, they get installed onto the shafts first, followed with the next layer, and so on and so forth. Now, in an earlier unboxing scene, I went ahead and described the components that make up all the road wheels. However, in that scene, I was missing one, and I forgot to mention one key important note, and that is of the innermost pan wheel compared to the outermost pan wheel. The two look identical to each other and can easily be inter-swapped, which can cause issues as the road wheels will not be assembled properly. To avoid any headaches, as orientation on the road wheels is absolutely key on these Tiger 1s, as well as the Panthers and King Tigers, I need to go ahead and describe the differences. Over here, I have the two wheels in question. This version here is the innermost pan, and this one here is the outermost pan wheel. From face value, the pieces look almost identical. However, the way to distinguish the two apart is on the innermost pan wheel. If we notice the little area, which would be drilled out and tapped for flange work, is not found on the innermost wheel, but it is found on the outer wheel. Also, the key difference is on the interior portion. If we notice the innermost pan wheel, it's just a flush fit, while the outermost pan wheel has a nub that emerges from it. It's important to keep these pieces orientated. As I mentioned before, they are not interchangeable, and if the wrong piece is installed, the rest of the wheels simply won't install properly and can cause a bunch of headaches. Now, on the Armortek instructions, they do go ahead and thoroughly label which wheel goes where. However, if you look in the drawing, you'll get a good idea on the actual installation. The text and the CAD image are one and the same, and you can use this with full faith as it is completely correct with the CAD drawing that you see here. As for installing the wheels, you first take your ball bearing and you insert it into its cavity. Now, sometimes, depending if there's any paint or primer, the bearing might be a snug fit, in which then a few taps with a rubber mallet should properly seat it. Then you go ahead and mount it to the corresponding torsion bar. Now again, pay attention to the weave, as this is important. The ball bearing should simply slide onto the axle to then you can move on to the next wheel. With the first layer of wheels out of the way, it is then time to focus on the next layer. This would be the layer of the other torsion bars that were skipped. For this layer here, we'll be utilizing the double version road wheel. Now, unlike the pan wheel, in which there are two different versions of the same wheel, one for the innermost and one for the outermost, for the double wheel, it is only one wheel that is supplied with the set that is used for both the inner and outer application. So no orientation and confusion can be made with this piece here. As for the installation, it is just like with the other unit. Simply peel off the protective tape that I added and install the wheel. As for installation, they are face outward, and the innermost cavity is pointing towards the interior of the tank. Note on the other completed row that I have here on the opposite side. Just like with the other road wheel, you simply just slide the wheel on until it seats firmly against the back portion of the swing arm. Again, repeat this procedure until completion. Now, it's also important to note that you will need to put a ball bearing in each of these road wheels. However, the ball bearing was already pre-installed by the customer, which is why I didn't need to add another one to the set that we have here. Once the road wheels are on, it's then time for the next layer. The next layer is first going to be done with the spacers. Now, like I mentioned before, there are two types of spacers found on the model. There's one for the double wheel and one for the single wheel. The difference between the two is that the double wheel has this shape to it, while the single wheel has this shape to it. As for installation, they are simply just slid onto the axle and are butt up against directly into the recesses on the wheel. Now for the single wheel version, if you notice there are two sides and they are not symmetrical. You have one side with a longer stem and the other side has a shorter stem. The shorter stem is what inserts into the recess on this inner wheel here. Once installed, it should be a nice flush fit. You can try to install it in reverse. However, if you do, there will be a sufficient gap which will cause issues when it comes time for the final layer. This is another one of those locations where you need to have all the parts installed in their proper orientation. In this angle you can see the piece in more detail. This is the part going to be installed incorrectly. As you can see, it slides in, but there is quite a substantial gap of the spacer making contact with the wheel. If the piece is on the correct way, the gap is a lot less. Same with the inner spacer for the double wheel. It just inserts directly into the cavity, as you see here. Now also, since the last scene, you can see I went ahead and added some fasteners to the double wheel. These fasteners here are purely just for show and are not serving any type of structural purposes. As you can see, the fasteners are painted in red oxide primer and then are weathered. This is as per the real vehicle, as red oxide primer was used on most of the fittings and components on these real German tanks. After the spacers are installed, it is now time to install the next layer, which will be the next row of double road wheels. As for the installation, it's again pretty straightforward at this point. You already have a seated ball bearing into the wheel. You simply insert the road wheel to the axle. Now I like to go ahead and insert all of the road wheels just prior to the installation of the mounting fastener, which I will do right now. Once the road wheels are fitted to the axle, it's now time to lock them on. As for the mounting, this is one procedure that has not changed with any of the Armortek builds from the first inception. And this is done with a single hex bolt, which is mounted in the centermost portion of the swing arm. The piece gets installed to a CNC metal disc. As you can see, the discs have been primed. Now this is, needless to say, one location where the use of Loctite or some strong thread lock is absolutely crucial. A nice smear on here, and the piece can now get installed. Simply gets threaded onto the axle, and you thread it on all the way. Make sure it's nice and tight. Once the piece is on, with the road wheel is now permanently fixed to the swing arm. Now, this is, like I mentioned before, Loctite is extremely crucial, as if the pieces are not Loctited, when the tank is in operation, the road wheels can unthread themselves from the center fastener, which can, needless to say, cause lots of issues. So Loctite is absolutely crucial for these components here. I cannot stress that enough. And as you can imagine, now that with this layer out of the way, it's now time to add on the final layer of road wheels, which will be this version here. It's the outer dish with the long neck. Just like with the other road wheel, they simply just plug onto their required locations. And just like with the other set, I will go ahead and take off the protective mask tape and paper just before the insertion of the wheels. Now, just like with the inner wheels, the outer wheels are retained to the tank in a similar format with a fastener and a disc. Only the difference is on these earlier kits, for the outer road wheel, that is facilitated with a much fatter disc and a much longer fastener. Now, unlike the inner wheel, in which the disc is just a small little CNC steel disc, which is reversible, for the outer wheel, it's not. As you can see, one side is totally flush, while the other side has a small little recess that is CNC'd into it. This recess is what points outward towards the exterior portion of the tank. The reason for this is for the hubcaps, which will be mounted after the installation of these discs. And once mounted, you'll see why the recess is present. As for the installation, again, it's just a simple thread-on application. And needless to say, as one quick reminder again, be sure to use Loctite and strong Loctite for the assembly of these components. Thread the piece on and make sure they are nice and tight. Once all the fasteners are tightened, the wheels are now permanently mounted to the tank. Being with the ball bearings, they do have a nice little roll to them, and with the suspension, you can see that they bounce and return to their correct, appropriate orientation. The last component that gets added to fully complete the road wheels is that of the hubcaps. As you can see from the hubcap on the outer wheel, you can see the recess and how and why it's there and how it dodges the hubcap. Just that little bit of clearance is all that's needed in order to properly mount on the part, which is why it's essential to not have this piece installed on in reverse. Now, one feature that the hubcaps do offer the model is that the hubcaps are just sized appropriately so that the inner disc that was shown before cannot fall out, which is a pretty neat feature in case that you have to remove the road wheel. You don't need to remove this component in order to fully take the wheel off. You simply take off the center fastener and the whole wheel pops off with the disc being captive inside this little recess here. With the exposed fastener, it kind of resembles that of like one of the newer Henlong or Tegan style 1/16 scale RC tanks. However, one thing that has been progressed since the release of this version is that Armortek kind of redesigned the way the hubcap system works, in that the more modern kits from Armortek feature a encapsulated fastener location. The encapsulated fastener location gives for better detail accuracy as opposed to having just this fastener exposed. But what it also does is that in case the fastener, for whatever reason, backs out and gets loose and falls out, on this version here, if the fastener falls out, it's gone. It hits the ground while the tank's in operation, and you're not going to be able to find it very easily. However, with the captive system, if the fastener does, for again, whatever reason, get loose, it is contained inside the recess, which repairing and remounting the part is a lot easier. As a quick tip, it's a good idea for anyone who has these older style Armorteks to keep a bag of fasteners as well as a bottle of Loctite and an Allen wrench in your go box, so that if any problem arises in field, it can quickly and easily be dealt with. However, again, with the use of the very strong thread lock, the chances of the fasteners backing out during operation is very remote. And here go the road wheels, all fully mounted to their appropriate locations. Now, as you can see, there is some of a gap in between these parts here. However, this is normal for this model. As you can see, the timing is perfect, and the wheels can rotate without making contact with each other. Now, one feature that is found on these early version of Armortek kits that if any new builder is building it and encounters, they might think it's an error, but it's actually part of the design. And that is of the wheel wobble. As you can see, even though the components are fully and tightly mounted, there is a little bit of wobble on the road wheels. This is not a mistake and is actually done as per design. The purpose of the wobble is that in case there is a pebble or any other type of foreign material that gets brought into the track, the wheel will be able to give slightly which will allow the pebble or the foreign object opportunity to fall out and avoid any damage to the track or even to the wheels themselves. Back when these kits first came out, several builders designed a rigidity brace system to eliminate the wheel wobble. However, like I mentioned in my other video, I have a Tiger from this same time period, and the suspension has been running flawlessly. It is noteworthy, however, to mention that it's interesting once I get to the 2015 version of the early Tiger to see how Armortek has redesigned the wheels, as all of their tanks that superseded this release here all feature wheels that have minimal or, if any, wobble whatsoever. With the row wheels out of the way, it's now time to get onto the model's rear idler wheels. The rear idler wheels that you see here are the kit original and are laid out in all their components. The wheels are pretty much standard on all Armortek kits and follow a similar format, just like with many of the other components that we've seen. The wheels themselves are unique in that they are a one-piece piece of aluminum. These pieces, I believe, are casted, and then they are turned and CNC down to get the appropriate undercuts as well as dimensions that you see here. Now, just like with a lot of the other parts on the build, as you can see, they are painted in a gray paint. Like I mentioned for the other parts, this was done by the customer prior to handing off the build to me to finish it off for him. Normally, these pieces would have been left in their bare metal color. The idler wheels are contained onto the axle via some very large ball bearings. As you can see, each wheel gets 2 ball bearings, one for each side. For the retention, that is done just like with the row wheels with a CNC'd steel disc. Only on this version here, you'll see there is a countersink, as a countersink fastener will be utilized for the mounting. As for the hubcap is a piece of white metal. It's a casting, and as you can see, it is quite rough. The component was made what looks like to be a very early 3D printed master, which was then made in a white metal format. There's a lot of tool marks, as well as it's a little bit rough in that the pieces are not squared away. These earlier pattern Armortek tanks, namely from this time period, featured a lot of white metal castings, as opposed to today, which white metal castings went the way of the wayside, and all the parts on current Armortek kits are made out of CNC'd aluminum. As for the idler, as one more note, as you can see, it is basically reversible, with the exception that one side does not have pre-tapped holes and the other side does. This is purely for the mounting of the idler wheel. Also, with the idler wheel, you can see that it doesn't necessarily fit onto its location appropriately, and some hand fitting will be required. Prior to the installation and completion of this piece, I will put it on the lathe in order to face it off to get rid of any of these tool marks that you see here. As a quick compare and contrast, here we have the 2003 version versus the 2015 version. As you can see, the wheels are basically the same pattern and are the same dimension. Only difference is that this one here was cast, while this one here is done on the CNC, which is evident from the tool marks that are remaining. As for the hubcaps, here we have the 2015 version of the hubcaps compared to the 2003 version. As you can see, same size, same basic design, but a lot more refined on the 2015 variant. And here's the hubcap now with all of the mods made. As you see, to compare and contrast, this one here is the stock configuration of the exact same hubcap. Like I mentioned before, it has some rather rough tooling marks. And here goes the exact same component that has now been squared off and smoothed and polished on the lathe. After the other hubcap is in the same specs as this one, both of these components will go into its coat of primer, to which then it will be installed to the idler. In addition to the exterior getting polished, the interior was also refined compared to the original. And the new revised piece fits on very flush and perfect on the kit rear idler wheel. And now the idler is ready for installation. Just prior to the installation, before the filming of the scene, both of the idler wheels had their base coat of Dunkelgelb spray gunned on, and the inner portion of the idler has its airbrush weathering, much for the same reason as the rest of the build. Also, just before filming the scene, I went ahead and peeled off the protective tape off the axle and applied a thin rim of grease, again for the same reasons as mentioned earlier. Now, I can install the bearings. I can install the one for the outer portion of the wheel first. Now, I could also install the inner portion. However, due to the road wheels already being installed, trying to manipulate and get the piece on to the tank can be a bit troublesome. So rather than having to wrestle with that, I went ahead and first installed the bearing. And now the idler wheel can simply slide on. With the piece now slid on, it's time for the installation of the disc, which is facilitated with a countersunk fastener, a smear of red Loctite gets added to the threads, and now gets bolted to the axle. Now, when it comes to installation of the idlers, I like to first crank down on them very hard, which will make the piece very stiff and won't turn properly. What I like to do is I first tighten it all the way to get a good baseline, and then from there I can gradually loosen it until finally the component is nice and thoroughly mounted to the axle. However, the wheel can spin absolutely freely. Once the thread lock sets in place, the component will be permanently installed to the model. After the idler wheel is mounted in place, it's then time to mount on the idler hubcap. As you can see, since the last scene, the coat of primer has been added. And with the primer added, you can see that the piece is nice and smooth, and there is no rough tool marks as was seen earlier. To mount them on, I use the kit supplied fasteners. Add a little bit of Loctite for the appropriate locations, and index the holes. And with the final fastener added, the hubcaps are now permanently attached to the wheel. Now, as a quick note, if anyone has one of these older kits and wants to go and forego the machining process with the lathe in order to smooth the component down, the new Armortek idler wheel hubcaps can be used, as they are literally the exact same size and dimensions as the older versions that we have here. As for the older versions, as you can see, they mount on pretty effortlessly. All of the holes line up perfectly with that of the stock idler wheel. With the completion of the wheels and suspension now out of the way, this concludes a huge portion of the build. The model will now be flipped over, and work will now be focusing on the motors as well as the other mechanical equipment that needs to be added to get the tank fully operational. All of these additions and features will be discussed in an upcoming future progress update video. And with that, that concludes this project update video for this 1/6 scale, radio controlled, early production Armortek Tiger 1. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, and don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thank you.